Hi everyone, welcome back. We're here to cover, we're still in chapter 1 here, obviously section 2 as this is day 2 of our lessons. So in the last class we talked about how the United States was in the antebellum period, how culturally and politically we were beginning to develop in the time period prior to the Civil War. So today what we're going to talk about really is the political buildup to the Civil War and the conditions that led up to the ultimate secession of the Confederate States from the Union. So we're going to begin first here with a little bit of politics. So there were two dominant parties within the United States in the antebellum period. You had the Democrat Party, which was dominant within the South. Now, it being the dominant party of the South, it was obviously a pro-slavery party. Now, when we hear this, we kind of get a little bit confused as we think of Democrats today as being largely on the side of civil rights and being pro-minority groups, especially African Americans. However, in the antebellum period and the period of the 1800s, the Democratic Party is the party of the South. It is the party that endorsed slavery, that endorsed segregation at the time. This is not the same Democratic Party that we know today, at least in how it performs. But in this time period, to solidify here, the Democratic Party is the party of the South, and they are full proponents of slavery. Now, the other major party of the time was known as the Whig Party. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, discussions about slavery would ultimately lead to them breaking apart and dissolving as a party. So, with the Whig Party now gone, new political parties will attempt to fill the void. Now, the three major ones that we're going to talk about are the Republican Party, the Free Soil Party, and the Know Nothing Party. Now, with the Republican Party, they are united in that they believe that slavery is evil. Slavery is wrong. However, where they kind of begin to disagree is in the method of what to do with slavery. So obviously you have those people within the Republican Party who are willing to get rid of slavery immediately, right now. However, you then have those in the Republican Party who are trying to act a bit more cautiously. They are concerned with the idea that should there be an attempt to get rid of slavery, that would cause the country to break apart immediately. The South would secede and it would lead to conflict. So while all Republicans were united in their hatred of slavery and that they felt it was an evil institution, they could not agree as to what to do about it because of the possible implications that it might have on the unity of the United States. But at the very least, the one thing that they could all kind of come to agree on in terms of policy was that slavery should not be expanded to the new Western territories. Now, our next two political parties, they're relatively minor but still influential at the time. So for example, we have the Free Soil Party, which was a pro-labor, pro-worker party, and definitively anti-slavery. And then lastly here we have the Know Nothing Party. Now the reason why they were called the Know Nothing is because if you tried to communicate with them or engage in a conversation about politics, they would simply say that they knew nothing. They didn't want to get involved in any manner or form of politics whatsoever. So they were largely anti-immigration, anti-Catholic, so needless to say they did not really participate all that much or were lasting all that long within American politics. Now, some other interesting ideas that come up during this time period was a plan by some in the South known as the Ostend Manifesto. Now, as we had talked about, when we look at the areas out west, so we're looking at places like New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, these places aren't exactly conducive to the expansion of slavery. Now, the issue will then kind of become, well, where can we then expand slavery? The future is very much indicating that slavery is only going to be contained to the South merely because it's not going to really flourish out west. There's no need for it out west. So Southerners begin to look for areas where they can actually influence, and expand and add to slavery. So the idea here is they want to take over Cuba. And so the idea behind the Austin Manifesto was that the United States would either buy Cuba from Spain or take it over entirely. Now, the whole idea behind this was that Cuba would be a very valuable asset for the United States in terms of its economic production. Now, how Cuba makes its money is through tobacco and the sugar industry. Both of these are very labor intensive. They would require the use of slaves that had been continued to be used in Cuba, and Southerners felt if they add Cuba, it would add another slave state, but also add an economic dynamic that would make it nearly impossible for the North to even consider getting rid of slavery whatsoever because of the economic impact of Cuba. Now, obviously, that would not take hold as Cuba is not part of the United States, but as we all know, this will not be the last time that we discuss Cuba and American annexation. All right. Also going on during this time period, there begins a swelling of an idea known as nullification. Now, this is where we hear a lot of the rhetoric concerning states' rights. Now, what certain states believed was that they had the ability to ignore federal law if they felt they were unconstitutional. The problem with that is, states are not the ones who are to judge the constitutionality of the law. That would be up to the Supreme Court. Now, the thing is, many of these crises were largely not related to slavery, but rather the issue of tariffs. A tariff, what that is, it's a tax on foreign goods. So whenever you would import something into your state, if it came from overseas, from outside of the country, you had to pay an additional tax on it, what's known as the tariff. Now, the thing is, for the South, their economy is largely import-based. So they do not manufacture things, but instead will import the products that they need, which then led to their cost of living being a little bit higher. So a lot of the South, especially South Carolina, were very much anti-tariff and anti this federal policy. Now, speaking of South Carolina, they would threaten to secede from the United States in 1850 over the Wilmot Proviso. Now, what that was, the Wilmot Proviso was simply it would extend the ban on slavery in the new Western territories, but as we discussed, that's largely a misnomer because many of these locations aren't conducive to slavery whatsoever. So, South Carolina will threaten to secede, and much like a toddler at a restaurant, the United States is basically going to stop the toddler from crying and just say, okay, we won't ban it even, because again, it's kind of pointless because you don't really need to ban it because you're not going to have slaves in New Mexico. But South Carolina will be given the iPad at the restaurant, and that will be, the end of South Carolina's sort of tantrum for now. Now, of course, the key figure of the new Republican Party is going to be Abraham Lincoln. Now, how he came to fame was due to a series of debates that he had in running for the Senate seat in Illinois in 1858. He would be running against Stephen Douglas, who was a supporter of slavery and not so much like a supporter of slavery, but rather he was actually a supporter of the Freeport Doctrine, which was this idea that you would pass laws in favor of slavery. So Douglas was a Democrat, but he was not obviously a strong proponent of slavery, simply because, again, he's in Illinois. Illinois isn't exactly known for slavery. But getting back to Lincoln, they would have a series of debates which could become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, as you might imagine, many of the debates focus on the issue of slavery, where Lincoln repeats his belief that yes, slavery is evil, slavery is wrong, but where he comes up a little bit different here is, as I kind of mentioned when introducing the Republican Party, yes, slavery is evil, but not so much that that we should get rid of it to avoid tearing the country apart. So Lincoln very much constantly reiterates, not only here in 1858, but when he runs for president in 1860, that he would not get rid of slavery because he did not want to risk the country breaking apart. Now, Lincoln did lose this race in 1858 to Douglas. This won't be the last time they run against each other, as we'll see in the next slide. But the transcripts of the debates and the notoriety of the debates will make Lincoln a little bit of a national celebrity, so to speak, in political circles, and will then make him a figure that will be more important in 1860. Speaking of which, Abraham Lincoln will run for president in 1860, but as we had discussed before, the North is a lot more heavily populated. There are more people living in the North. The North is not going to be on the side of the Democrats. They're going to go with the Republican, and as such, because they have the population in the North, not to mention the two states out west in California and Oregon, Lincoln will win the election of 1860. The Republicans will gain a majority in Congress. And to the South, what this means is that they felt that they have lost their voice in the government. That now with Republicans in control, especially with one as president, the Republicans, they are going to get rid of slavery. And so this is still in the face of Lincoln coming out and saying, I am not going to get rid of slavery. He doesn't want to risk the country breaking apart. Even in spite of all of that, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina will announce its secession from the United States. In a secession, it does mention the transgressions of the federal government, but most notably, the one about possibly getting rid of slavery. So what's funny about this, and not like in a comical sense, but when South Carolina mentions all these things, Lincoln isn't even president yet. He was elected in November of 1860. He doesn't take office until March of 1861. So Lincoln won't be in office for another 3 months, and yet here we have South Carolina saying, well, Lincoln's going to get rid of slavery, so let's get out of the country. Now, the following month, on January 9th, 1861, Mississippi would announce its secession from the United States, and Florida on January 10th, being the third state to secede. And the country that they will eventually come up with together is what's known as the Confederate States of America. Now, its first, only, and last president is Jefferson Davis. Now, when we look at the organization of the Confederacy, as we'll call it from here on out, the Confederate States of America, its constitution, was a lot reflected more of the Articles of Confederation rather than the Constitution which came after it. So it required a supermajority of states in order to agree to do anything. So, for example, 9 out of the 11 sitting congressional delegations had to agree on any policy in order for it to become law. The Constitution also explicitly allowed slavery, and that the states could do essentially whatever they want, free from the interference of what other states had wanted. So when we look at the Confederacy, it is made up of 11 states, though the Confederacy will count 13, but 2 of them are not part of it. So the Confederacy, as we know, is South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Those are the 11. Now, they acted as though Kentucky and Missouri were also part of the Confederacy, but they never actually joined it. They were never part of it. You had some people in those states who did want to become part of the Confederacy, but they ultimately did not. Also, I do want to take a moment here to note the flags here of the Confederacy. Now, believe it or not, the Confederacy, we think, given all the history, and especially if you go through the South, all the statues, the monuments to the Confederacy, you would think it was this long-lasting thing, that the Civil War went on forever. It lasted just barely over 4 years. The Civil War lasts from 1861 until 1865. Actually, it's just under 4 years. To put it in perspective, Phineas and Ferb went longer than the Confederacy. Now, in that time, in that just under 4-year span, they had 3 different flags, as you can see there on the right. The first one, the first official Confederate flag, this flag was seen as too similar to the American flag, and as more states joined, we now see the popular stars and bars as placed on a white background flag. But as you might imagine, having a white background flag is not the best idea, especially if it's waving in the air, because as people saw it, as it waved through the air, looked like it was a surrender flag, which then brings us to the third official Confederate flag, where they had to add a red stripe at the end to make sure that, they weren't surrendering. As you'll see here, a lot of the stuff that the South and the Confederacy does is rather quite dumb, and the flag is just one of them. Now, Taking a look here, so this is the map of the Union and the Confederacy. So the states in blue, those would be the ones who remained in the Union. They are still part of the United States. The ones in gray, those are of the Confederacy. Now, a couple of little things here that you might notice. So, for example, you see those states there in red, Missouri and Kentucky, as well as Delaware and Maryland. Now, those are what we refer to as the border states. Now, what's rather interesting about those is that those states, those 4 states, remained in the Union. They still stayed part of the United States. But the reason why we highlight them is because they still had slavery. So, just because a state had slavery did not mean that it necessarily joined the Confederacy, because as we see here, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, they would remain part of the Union despite them still holding slaves, something that we'll talk about in importance when we discuss the Emancipation Proclamation in Section 3. Also, just another quick note here, the reason for the color choices, the Union is in blue, as that is the color of their uniforms, and and a lot of the Union military, especially those from Columbus, Ohio, were nicknamed the Blue Jackets, whereas the Confederate uniforms, when they were actually able to have them, were in gray, hence the gray color there. Now, in comparing the two sides, the North has the very large advantage. Its population is 4 times that of the South, 22 million to 5.5. They are far more industrialized. They have railroads, they have factories, they have roads, they have mines, they have canals, they have the natural resources from said mines like coal, iron, and gold. And also, very importantly, if you're going to be surrounded by water, it's a pretty good idea to have a navy. Now, the thing is, does the Confederacy have some advantages? Yes. So, for example, they have much better military leadership. So, as we had talked about in sectionalism, Americans were more loyal to the idea of where they are from rather than the United States. And the best example of that is General Robert E. Lee. Now, General Robert E. Lee was the commanding general at West Point. He was the general who trained all of the other generals. But when Virginia became part of the Confederacy following the attack on Fort Sumter, General Lee, who had been offered command of all the Union militaries by President Lincoln, will deny that request and instead join the Confederacy. So, the South did have the advantage, especially early on, but again, we'll talk about that when it comes to Section 3. Now, one of the advantages that some may say was that of slave labor. I have it here as a question mark because it's not really an advantage. Having an enslaved population doing things for you is not exactly advantageous, especially in battle. Now, they were deeply passionate about their cause. They saw themselves as a Second American Revolution, but merely being motivated to fight is not a guarantee of victory. And in combination with their experienced military command, they also had a deep knowledge of the battlefield sites. As the Confederacy and the battles were mostly fought in the South, we then saw this as they knew how to deal with those sites. They were familiar with them, whereas the Northern commanders simply were not. Now, as far as their weakness, one of the things that the Union had trouble with was recruiting soldiers. It was very difficult to get people, say, from Iowa to, possibly sacrifice their lives, to keep Mississippi or Alabama in the Union. It was a very tough, not negotiation, but rather just, you can't really attract people to join the military to fight to keep Alabama. It's not the best motivating factor. But as for the South, their weaknesses are incredibly bad. For starters, they have very little manufacturing capability. They don't have a lot of factories. So as the war goes on, they're going to need more supplies. They're going to need weapons. They're going to need guns. They're going to need bullets. But the thing is, though, the majority of the factories that make those things, they're in the North. And they're not about to sell them to the Confederacy, which then means that they would have to be heavily dependent upon exports. The problem with that, of course, well, it would help if you had a navy, which the Union does, but the Confederacy really does not. And as those things are coming in from overseas, across the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico, again, it would help to have a navy to actually be able to patrol those waters. Now, as for the actual beginning of the Civil War, that will come on April 12th, 1861, at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which was a Union Navy base off the coast of South Carolina. President Jefferson Davis would order the attack, knowing that he essentially has to start the war. He can't just leave a Union base right off of its shore, but he knows by doing this it is going to spark an armed conflict. So, with the fall of Fort Sumter and the attack on it, the Union is now mobilized to begin attacking the Confederacy, as well as the Confederacy is now moving to attack and move in more territory. So, with that said, that brings us now to the beginning of the Civil War. So, thank you all for joining me today. Next time, we will discuss the battles of the Civil War, albeit in a very concise manner, but we will discuss the outcome of the Civil War and how the battles began to turn the tide and the final outcome. So, thank you guys. I hope this all prepared you for Section 2. And again, if you have any questions, please see me in class or message below, and I will see you later. Thank you all, and have a great day. Bye, guys.